I'm not writing this to be believed. That matters. If you're reading this and treating it like a warning or a prophecy or some kind of call to arms, then you've already missed the point. The world doesn't end because people ignore warnings. It ends because people trust systems they don't understand and assume someone else is watching the edges. I'm writing this because memory is heavier than silence, and because there are things that rot inside you if they don't get out. I don't expect thanks. I don't want recognition. The men and women who mattered most in this story will never be named, and that's not an accident or a cover up. It's protection. For their families, for their memory, and for the fragile illusion that the world is safer than it really is. My designation during the operation was Operator 7. Not my name, a convenience. Names invite attachment, and attachment clouds judgment. If you're looking for a face to picture, don't bother. I look like 1,000 other men who learned early that their bodies were tools long before they were symbols. 6'3", heavyset, not fast in a sprint but relentless over distance. The kind of build that survives attrition. I was trained to operate in places where rules dissolve and decisions have weight measured in lives rather than legality. I have carried weapons into places that no longer had laws. I have watched governments die quietly. And I have learned the hard way that the most dangerous moments in human history don't arrive with fanfare. They arrive disguised as routine. This is the story of one of those moments. Dystopia was never supposed to matter. That sounds cruel, but it's true. In the global hierarchy of attention, dystopia was a background country, big on maps, loud in regional politics, but ultimately manageable. Analysts described it using words like contained, predictable, isolated. It had a strongman, an ongoing border war, and an economy under sanctions that were described as painful but stabilizing. Stabilizing is a comforting word. It implies control. The people who used it had never stood in a city when the power didn't come back on. Dystopia's war had been grinding on for years, the kind of war that never quite escalates enough to terrify the world but never de-escalates enough to heal. Artillery duels, drone strikes, funerals spaced just far enough apart to avoid headlines. The sanctions were layered slowly, deliberately, the way a boa constrictor tightens, never enough to kill outright, always enough to exhaust. From the outside, it looked sustainable. From the inside, it was starvation by paperwork. I didn't know any of this personally at first. Not really. For most of my career, dystopia was just a word on a screen, a location in a briefing, a place where other people lived and died while my own country debated budgets and politics. Then the lights went out. When infrastructure fails, the first instinct of a government is to lie gently. They don't do it because they are evil. They do it because panic is contagious and truth spreads faster than solutions. So, they soften the edges. They say temporary. They say cyber incident. They say maintenance cycle. In dystopia, the first blackouts were announced with schedules. People planned around them. They cooked earlier. They charged phones. They bought candles and battery packs. Some even treated it like a novelty, a reminder of older times when outages were inconveniences rather than threats. Then the schedules stopped. That's the moment collapse becomes real. Not when the power fails, but when no one dares promise when it will return. I learned later that the grid didn't fail all at once. It fractured. Substations went dark one by one. Control systems stopped communicating. Spare parts that used to arrive from abroad didn't arrive at all. Engineers worked until exhaustion, then worked longer, then stopped showing up when fuel ran out. Electricity isn't just light, it's water pressure, sewage flow, refrigeration, communication, medicine. When it goes, it drags everything else with it. Hospitals were the last places to fall. They always are. Backup generators roared to life, loud and defiant, like engines refusing to admit defeat. Doctors performed surgery by headlamp. Nurses rationed antibiotics like contraband. Administrators made decisions that would haunt them forever. Who got oxygen, who didn't, who could be moved, who would be made comfortable. Comfort becomes a euphemism when systems fail. When the generators finally stopped, the hospitals didn't close. They just stopped pretending they could save everyone. That was the point at which dystopia crossed from crisis into something darker. The strongman disappeared shortly after that. There was no coup footage, no dramatic arrest, no execution video circulated online. He simply stopped appearing. One day, his face was on every remaining screen that could still flicker to life. The next day, there was nothing. Rumors rushed in to fill the vacuum. Bunker, exile, assassination, foreign extraction. Each theory said more about the fear of the person spreading it than about the truth. In my experience, leaders who vanish during collapse aren't cowards or masterminds. They are men who finally understand that symbols don't eat and speeches don't keep the lights on. Authority cannot survive absence. It fractures. In dystopia, it fractured into local power. You don't get warlords because people suddenly become evil. You get warlords because systems disappear and someone still has food, fuel, or guns. Sometimes all three. Men who had once commanded a few dozen loyal followers suddenly controlled checkpoints, fuel depots, radio towers, water access. They declared themselves governors, protectors, liberators. They issued curfews, demanded taxes, enforced order with violence and called it stability. To starving people, stability looks like mercy. Territory changed hands daily. Alliances lasted hours. Loyalty was transactional. If you could keep people alive one more week than the next man, you became legitimate. This was the phase where most collapsed states die quietly. Dystopia would have followed that pattern if it hadn't possessed nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons changed the math of collapse. A starving country without them is a humanitarian disaster. A starving country with them is an extinction risk. Dystopia had inherited its arsenal from an era when permanence was assumed. Storage sites, maintenance facilities, command nodes, all built with the expectation that the state existed tomorrow, that chains of command held, that uniforms meant obedience. None of that was true anymore. The first intelligence intercept that mentioned nuclear sites wasn't about launch, it was about ownership. Local commanders discussing which facilities lay in whose territory, militia leaders arguing about whether controlling a warhead meant foreign governments would negotiate with them, men who didn't understand the technology but understood leverage. A nuclear weapon doesn't have to be fired to change the world. It just has to exist in the wrong hands. That was the moment dystopia stopped being a regional problem. That was the moment the world leaned forward. I received the call before the situation became public. No explanation, no framing. Just coordinates, a window, and silence. When orders arrive like that, it's because the people sending them don't have time to convince you. They assume you'll go. They were right. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I never do. The fewer people who know where you are, the fewer people who have to live with worry they can't act on. As the aircraft lifted off, I looked out over a world where lights still worked, where traffic still flowed, where people complained about things that would not matter if they knew what was unfolding elsewhere. That contrast is something you never unsee, and as dystopia grew closer beneath us, dark and uneven and wrong, I understood something with a clarity that still hasn't faded. The world survives not because it is stable, but because collapse is usually local. That night, collapse was about to test whether it could stay that way. Collapse doesn't announce itself with a siren. It creeps. It moves in through the gaps people ignore because acknowledging them would mean admitting that comfort is temporary. In dystopia, the blackouts didn't feel like disaster at first. They felt like inconvenience, layered on top of fatigue. People adapted. That's what humans do best. They cooked earlier, they pulled generators, they slept in shifts, they shared rumors the way people always do when certainty is gone, quietly, urgently, with more confidence than evidence. The government tried to project control. Press releases came out on a schedule long after the infrastructure that supported those schedules had failed. Officials spoke about grid rebalancing, external interference, temporary hardship. They used words that implied engineers were still in charge. They weren't. Engineers don't fix things without parts, and dystopia had run out of parts months earlier. When I first entered the outskirts of a major city, what struck me wasn't how dark it was. It was how uneven the darkness felt. Entire neighborhoods were blacked out, silent, except for dogs and distant shouting. Then, suddenly, a few blocks would glow, generators humming, lights blazing like defiance. Those places became magnets. People drifted toward light the way moths do, hoping warmth meant safety. It rarely did. Generator-lit buildings became targets. Fuel is louder than gunfire in a collapsed city. You can hear it from blocks away, and everyone understands what it means. Someone still has power. Someone still has something worth taking. Gunfire became background noise within days. Not constant, but frequent enough that people stopped flinching at the first shot. That's another quiet milestone of collapse. when fear turns into calculation. Is it close? Is it moving toward us? Is it worth reacting? Most of the time, the answer was no. Electricity failing was survivable. Water failing was not. Pumping stations went down as the grid fractured. Treatment plants shut off one by one when chemicals ran out of control. Systems failed. The taps didn't go dry immediately. Pressure dropped. Flow weakened. Then the water turned brown. Authorities told people to boil it. People laughed. You don't boil water when you don't have power, fuel, or clean containers. I saw people carrying plastic jugs from rivers that had been dumping sewage upstream for decades. I saw families collect rainwater off rusted roofs, filtering it through shirts and prayer. I saw men fight over access to wells that had been dry since their grandparents were alive. Disease followed water failure the way flies follow rot. Hospitals filled with dehydration, dysentery, cholera, names that hadn't meant much in dystopia for generations. Doctors worked until they collapsed. Nurses slept in stairwells between shifts. Supplies dwindled until medicine became triage by cruelty. Who could be saved? Who could be made comfortable? I watched a doctor argue with a mother over the last bag of saline. Not loudly, quietly, like two people negotiating the price of a life in a market neither of them wanted to be in. The doctor won. The mother screamed anyway. Refrigeration is one of those modern miracles people forget exists until it doesn't. When the power failed, food didn't disappear overnight. It spoiled. Meat first, then dairy, then anything that relied on controlled temperature to stay safe. Freezers turned into breeding grounds for bacteria. People learned fast what food poisoning feels like when there are no doctors left to treat it. Markets closed, warehouses were looted, aid shipments were intercepted by whoever controlled the roads that day. The idea of a supply chain became a joke. People ate whatever they could find. Dogs vanished first, then cats, then pigeons. Hunger didn't make people violent immediately. It made them quiet, weak, suspicious. When violence came, it was sudden and final. I saw a man beaten to death over a sack of moldy rice. No one intervened. Everyone was saving their strength. Hospitals don't collapse when the doors close. They collapse when the staff gives up pretending. Generators ran until fuel ran out. Oxygen tanks emptied. Ventilators became furniture. Surgical theaters turned into places where pain was endured rather than fixed. Doctors still showed up. They always do. But when you can't clean wounds properly, when you can't sterilize instruments, when you can't give antibiotics, medicine becomes a gamble. Every incision risks killing the patient faster than the injury did. I walked through one hospital that had stopped admitting anyone over 60. No announcement, no policy posted, just quiet enforcement. Younger patients were escorted in, older ones were turned away with apologies that sounded rehearsed. A nurse told me they'd stopped writing names on charts. It hurts less, she said, if you don't know them. I didn't ask how long she'd been awake. This is the part people misunderstand. Collapse doesn't turn everyone into monsters. It turns everyone into accountants. People start calculating value in real time: food, water, protection, ammunition, loyalty. Morality doesn't disappear, it just becomes a luxury item. Neighbors who'd shared meals for years began locking doors. Communities fractured along lines no one had cared about before: accents, last names, old grudges. Fear sharpens memory. I saw a woman refuse water to a man because he'd once voted for the wrong person. She didn't shout, she didn't rage, she just said no and closed the door. That kind of quiet cruelty is harder to stop than violence. As the central government evaporated, a local authority rushed in to replace it. Men with guns and fuel declared curfews. They issued papers. They promised protection. They punished theft harshly, except when they were the ones stealing. To people who hadn't eaten in days, order, any order, felt like salvation. This is where the warlords took shape. Some started with good intentions: former officers trying to keep neighborhoods safe, community leaders organizing food distribution, men who genuinely believed they could hold things together. Others were predators who'd been waiting their whole lives for the rules to vanish. The difference mattered less with each passing day. Power concentrates under stress, and once it concentrates, it rarely lets go. The first time I heard civilians mention nuclear sites, it wasn't in fear, it was in hope. Foreigners won't bomb us if we are near them, a man said to his family while they camped near a perimeter fence. They'll protect it, another replied. That means they'll protect us. That logic makes sense when you don't understand what nuclear weapons actually represent. I listened to militia chatter later, men arguing about which sides were in whose territory, who had the right to negotiate with the outside world. They spoke about warheads the way people talk about hostages: leverage, bargaining chips, guarantees. None of them understood that once nuclear weapons enter a collapse, nobody negotiates, they intervene. International attention arrived late, as it always does. Analysts argued about timelines. Diplomats issued statements urging restraint to people who no longer recognize the concept. 8 organizations tried to negotiate corridors that shifted daily with gunfire. And quietly, without press releases or announcements, planning began. Contingency planning, worst case planning. The kind of planning that assumes everyone else will fail and asks one brutal question: how do we stop this from ending the world? By the time my team moved toward the first confirmed nuclear site, dystopia was no longer a country. It was a collection of crises stacked on top of each other, each one making the next inevitable. And somewhere out at sea, a submarine was listening in silence and making its own calculations. Warlords don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with banners or titles or speeches about destiny. They emerge the way mold does, quietly, inevitably, wherever conditions allow them to grow. Dystopia didn't suddenly fill with monsters. It filled with men who realized, almost at the same moment, that there were no longer consequences strong enough to stop them. When the central authority vanished, power didn't disperse evenly. It pooled. It flowed toward whoever already had three things: guns, fuel, and people willing to listen. Sometimes that last one was the hardest. The earliest warlords were often the most convincing: former military officers who still had loyal subordinates, police chiefs who controlled armories, local strongmen who had spent years running protection rackets that now looked suspiciously like governance. They spoke the language of order. They issued curfews for safety. They confiscated weapons to prevent chaos. They rationed food to ensure fairness. And for a short time, it worked. People are willing to surrender freedom for predictability, especially when their children are hungry. A man with a rifle who promises bread tomorrow sounds a lot like a savior when yesterday had none. I watched a former colonel stand on the hood of a truck and announce himself as temporary regional authority. People applauded, not because they trusted him, but because applause felt like hope. Hope is cheap at first. Territory in dystopia stopped being about borders and started being about assets. A fuel depot was worth more than 10 city blocks. A water source was worth more than a hospital. A radio tower was worth more than an army. Men fought over intersections, not because they mattered strategically, but because controlling a crossroad meant taxing everyone who passed through. Checkpoints became toll booths. Identification papers became tickets to survival. Maps changed daily, so did loyalties. One warlord we tracked lost half his men overnight when another offered them fuel and ammunition instead of promises. There were no ideological defections, just math. Every warlord understood one truth instinctively: short-term control beats long-term planning when tomorrow isn't guaranteed. That made nuclear sites irresistible. Before collapse, nuclear weapons were ideas, symbols, deterrents, things discussed in conferences and academic papers. No one in dystopia had seen one up close, and that distance made them feel unreal. Collapse removed the abstraction. Once word spread that nuclear storage facilities existed within reach, they became mythic. People spoke about them the way medieval peasants spoke about castles, places of power, places that made you untouchable. Warlords didn't need to understand launch codes, they only needed to understand leverage. I intercepted radio traffic where militia leaders argued over which side mattered more, who could negotiate with foreigners, whether owning a warhead meant sanctions would be lifted or aid would be forced through. One voice said something I won't forget: "They won't dare attack us if we hold it. It's too important." That belief killed a lot of people. Our first direct encounter with a warlord-controlled nuclear site wasn't cinematic. No gunfight, no standoff. It was a negotiation conducted through layers of paranoia. The site sat in a territory controlled by a man who'd once been a logistics officer. Smart, methodical, he understood supply chains and choke points, which made him dangerous. We approached under the cover of darkness, but he knew we were coming. He always would have. You don't move that kind of force without ripples. He sent an intermediary, a thin man with shaking hands and a rifle he clearly didn't know how to use. "They want to talk," the man said. "They say this place is under their protection now. Protection is a funny word. It always means the same thing. This is mine. We talked, not about ideology, not about legitimacy, about survival. He wanted guarantees: food, fuel, recognition, a future where he wasn't hunted once the chaos settled. We offered none of that. We offered him a way out. He refused. That night, his men tried to breach an internal access corridor they didn't understand. Safety systems did the rest. We secured the site while they buried their dead. He disappeared afterward. Maybe he fled. Maybe someone decided he was expendable. In collapse, leadership turnover is fast and violent. Not all of them wanted to rule. Some just wanted to burn. These were the ones who terrified me. Men who had lost families, homes, futures. Men who saw the world as already over and wanted to take something with them into the ashes. They didn't talk about leverage or negotiation. They talked about revenge, about making someone pay. One such group tried to storm a maintenance facility, believing they could sell a warhead to a foreign power. They didn't get close. The aftermath was instructional. Their bodies were left where they fell, a warning to anyone else who thought nuclear weapons were trophies rather than traps. Fear spreads faster than hope in a place like that. For every warlord, there were thousands of civilians caught in the gravity well around him. Families forced to provide food, children pressed into service as messengers because they could slip through checkpoints, old men guarding intersections with rusted rifles because the alternative was starvation. I saw a school turned into a barracks. I saw a church turned into a warehouse. I saw a hospital turned into a prison for people who couldn't pay protection fees. This is the part that never makes it into reports. Collapse isn't just violence, it's repurposing. Everything becomes something else, morality included. While this was happening on the ground, pressure was building above it. Foreign intelligence agencies weren't blind. Satellites tracked movement. Analysts map alliances. Risk assessment grew more dire by the hour. The problem wasn't that one warlord might gain control of a nuclear site. The problem was that several might. Fragmentation is a nightmare scenario. Multiple actors, partial knowledge, competing incentives. No single hand on the wheel, no clear deterrence. That's when the order came down the chain. Secure all known sites immediately. No negotiation unless necessary. No delays for politics. No assumptions about stability. This wasn't peacekeeping. This was emergency surgery. I felt the shift before it was spoken. Communications tightened. Checklists got shorter. Contingencies multiplied. The language lost its optimism. We stopped asking if something could go wrong and started asking how bad it would be when it did. One night, after securing a partially compromised storage facility, I sat on a concrete step and watched the city burn in the distance. Not all of it, just pockets. Fires starting and stopping, like the country was exhaling its last strength. That's when I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think yet. We weren't racing the warlords, we were racing time. And time was already winning. While we moved from side to side, Intel kept circling back to one unresolved question. Where was the submarine? A ballistic missile submarine doesn't need territory. It doesn't need supply lines the way ground forces do. It doesn't need legitimacy. It just needs silence. And silence is easy to find underwater. Every hour that passed without confirmation made the room heavier. We all felt it. The unspoken understanding that no matter how many land-based sites we secured, one launch could make all of it irrelevant. Warlords were dangerous, but somewhere beneath the ocean, a single crew might decide the world had already ended. And that thought followed me into every dark corridor, every locked vault, every silent facility. The moment the order came down to secure all known nuclear sites, the character of the operation changed. Up to that point, we'd been moving like surgeons, precise, careful, conservative. Insert, assess, lock down, withdraw. Every action weighed against escalation, every trigger pull measured against what it might ignite tomorrow. That luxury vanished. This became a race against entropy. You don't secure nuclear weapons in a collapsed state by being elegant. You do it by being faster than chaos. People imagine international intervention as noisy. Press conferences, flags, speeches about unity. In reality, it arrives silently. Aircraft with no markings, units that don't wear national identifiers, specialists who don't introduce themselves beyond function. The world's most powerful nations didn't deploy. They slid in. British teams took perimeter control with a patience that bordered on eerie. German engineers moved like accountants under fire, methodical, exact, unshakable. French specialists handled disablement procedures with a seriousness that suggested they understood exactly how bad the alternative was. Japanese teams spoke little, worked flawlessly, and treated every warhead like it was already trying to kill them. We didn't argue about politics. We argued about minutes. The hardest part wasn't the fighting. It was the information, or rather, the lack of it. Satellite imagery showed movement but not intent. A convoy could be reinforcements or refugees. A heat signature could be generators or a gathering crowd. Radio intercepts were fragmented, distorted, often deliberately misleading. Collapse turns intelligence into a hall of mirrors. We operated on partial truths and educated guesses. Every site we approached carried the possibility that someone had already arrived before us, or that someone would arrive while we were inside. At one facility, we breached a secondary access point only to find a militia squad already there, arguing in whispers about how to move a component they didn't understand. They froze when they saw us. So did we. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Everyone knew what stood between us. Then one of them lowered his rifle. That decision probably saved the world. We disarmed them, escorted them out, and secured the site. They left quietly, terrified and alive. Fear is sometimes a better deterrent than force. Not all encounters ended that way. At a maintenance depot outside a mid-sized city, we arrived to find external defenses already active, barricades, overwatch positions. A local warlord had beaten us there and understood enough to know that possession was temporary, but temporary was better than nothing. Negotiation failed in under a minute. The firefight was brief and brutal. Confined spaces amplified sound and fear. Every shot echoed like an accusation. We moved fast, not because we were brave, but because hesitation inside a nuclear facility is a special kind of suicide. One round struck a control panel that nobody wanted damaged. The room went very still. Every man there understood that one bad spark could turn the entire building into a problem no one could solve. It didn't. Luck is real. Anyone who tells you otherwise hasn't been alive long enough. We secured the site and pulled out with smoke still hanging in the air. I didn't look back. Civilians never leave nuclear sites once they arrive. They linger. They believe importance radiates outward like warmth. They believe if the world cares enough to protect something, it will protect them too. They were wrong. More than once, we had to clear families out of perimeter zones. Some left willingly, others begged. A few resisted. One woman clung to a fence and screamed that if we pushed her away, someone else would bomb the place and kill her children. She wasn't wrong. She just didn't understand that staying was worse. There is no manual for explaining global risk to someone whose entire world fits inside a tent. Securing a nuclear site isn't the same as neutralizing it. Security is temporary. Disablement is final. Engineers worked under pressure that most people will never understand. Every step documented. Every component treated like a loaded weapon. Warheads weren't dismantled theatrically. They were made boring. Boring is good. Boring means inert. Boring means safe. Boring means the world keeps spinning. But disablement takes time. Time we didn't have. As more sites fell under coalition control, something unsettling became clear. We were winning on land and losing somewhere else. Every update about secured facilities was followed by silence on the submarine question. No confirmation, no denial, just absence. Absence is worse than bad news. I remember standing in a half-lit control room, watching specialists work, and realizing that we could do everything right, every checklist, every protocol, and still fail. Because all it took was one launch, one crew deciding that orders no longer mattered, one man interpreting silence as permission. The tone changed again, command channels shortened, authority concentrated, decisions were made faster, with fewer voices. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone understood. We were approaching the point where land-based success would become irrelevant. At one site, while engineers worked to render a warhead inert, I received a message that made my stomach tighten. Submarine remains unaccounted for. Launch capability assumed. Assumed. That word does a lot of work. It means prepare for the worst without admitting that the worst is already in motion. By the time the last confirmed site was secured, dystopia was quieter. Not peaceful. exhausted. Warlords had lost leverage, militias melted away, provisional authorities began forming structures that resembled governance. 8 corridors reopened, cautiously. From the outside, it looked like progress. Inside our circles, nobody celebrated, because the most dangerous weapon dystopia possessed had never been on land, and it still hadn't spoken. I remember thinking briefly that maybe we'd been wrong, that maybe the submarine crew had lost cohesion or scuttled or simply refused to act. Hope is a dangerous thing when time isn't measured in minutes. That hope died without warning. The ocean doesn't panic. That's what makes it such a perfect place to end the world. On land, collapse announces itself with noise, shouting, gunfire, generators dying, buildings burning. At sea, everything that matters happens in silence: pressure, distance, steel hulls cutting through water that has swallowed empires without noticing. The dystopian submarine vanished the way only submarines can, quietly. At first, its failure to respond to authentication challenges was treated as damage, a comms issue, a degraded antenna, something fixable once the chaos on land settled. The explanation lasted less than a day. Analysts noticed its patrol pattern didn't align with doctrine anymore. It wasn't maintaining deterrence posture. It wasn't shadowing known adversaries. It wasn't behaving like a strategic asset under control. It was drifting, then correcting, then moving with intent. A ballistic missile submarine doesn't need orders to be dangerous. It doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs a crew that decides silence is authority. Every hour without confirmation tightened the noose. The worst part wasn't what we knew, it was what we couldn't rule out. People imagine submarine crews as automatons, perfectly disciplined, conditioned to obey no matter what. That's comforting. It's also wrong. The submarine crews are human beings sealed inside steel for months, fed information selectively, trained to trust systems that assume the state still exists tomorrow. What happens when that assumption collapses? What happens when messages stop coming? When the government that issued you orders no longer broadcasts? When the only certainty is the weapons under your feet? Somewhere, deep beneath the surface, a handful of people were making decisions without context, without oversight, without a world that could reassure them they were still part of something larger. They didn't need to be insane. They just needed to be convinced that inaction was riskier than action. The launch wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a countdown or a speech. It came with data. Space-based infrared sensors noticed a bloom of heat where there should have been none. Radar systems confirmed ascent profiles that only one thing on Earth produces: ballistic. Maritime origin, dystopian asset, confirmed. The words moved through command channels like ice water through veins. One missile. Just one. That detail mattered more than anyone outside the room would ever understand. One missile creates doubt. It forces confirmation loops, verification steps, arguments over whether this is an accident, a malfunction, a bluff. It burns time. precious, irreplaceable time. Had they launched everything, the response would have been immediate and overwhelming. One missile is subtle, one missile is cruel. Once a ballistic missile is airborne, the sky stops being sky. It becomes matte. Trajectory calculations, burn phases, separation windows, impact predictions that tighten with every passing second. Screens filled with lines and cones and probabilities that meant cities to the people reading them. The room where I stood felt smaller with each update. MRF capable. Decoy deployment expected. That meant the missile wasn't just a weapon, it was a puzzle designed to kill decision makers first. Warheads and decoys would separate, creating a cloud of objects moving at impossible speed. Each one would look identical to defenses. Each one would demand a response. And defenses can't afford to be wrong. Naval systems were first. Ships already positioned for contingency fired interceptors into the rising threat. Clean launches, perfect telemetry. One interceptor scored a hit. It didn't matter. It had struck a decoy. That's the nightmare of MRFs. You can do everything right and still be dead. Higher, layer interceptors engaged next. Faster systems, smarter guidance, better algorithms. They fired. They missed. Or rather, they hit pieces of the cloud that didn't matter. Ground-based systems spun up around population centers. The last line, the shield that exists to give people a chance they'll never know they had. They fired too. The results were inconclusive, which is the worst result of all. There is a point in every crisis where the manuals run out. People like to believe everything has a procedure, that somewhere someone already thought of this and wrote it down. They didn't. Because no one writes down what to do when the world is about to end and the rules aren't enough. The phrase came through the channel, quiet and devastating. Probability of successful intercept trending below acceptable thresholds. That's how professionals say we are losing. Someone asked for confirmation of the target. The answer came back the same as before. Target under assessment, which means anywhere, which means everywhere. The room went quiet, not because people stopped talking, but because they started listening. Listening for the decision. It didn't come as an order, it came as permission. Alternative intercept options authorized. That sentence cracked something open. Alternate means untested. Alternate means extreme. Alternate means someone is about to die. The platform was already airborne. It always was. There are aircraft designed to observe, to penetrate airspace quietly, to operate at altitudes where conventional defenses don't reach. This one wasn't built to ram anything, but it was built to survive where others couldn't. It climbed hard, accelerating past the regime where lift behaves politely and into thin air near space, above weather, above traffic, above the world. At that altitude, the sky turns black and the earth curves away beneath you. Speed stops being Mach and starts being survival. Heat builds in places no human was ever meant to endure for long. The pilots didn't use names. They were anonymous by design. That mattered. Names turn sacrifice into politics. Anonymous keeps it clean. That line slipped through the net like a confession. No speech, no ceremony, just fact. They were already where no one wanted to be. Someone asked what they were targeting. The answer came back without hesitation. Main body, the bus, the parent structure. Kill it before separation completes and the warheads die unborn. Miss it and nothing else matters. No one spoke. Telemetry streamed. The object cloud tightened. The separation window approached. And then data spiked. Tracking faltered. The cloud collapsed into noise. For a fraction of a second, systems struggled to understand what had just happened. The clarity. Main body neutralized. Multiple tracks lost. No viable re-entry profiles detected. The pilot's channel went silent. Not dramatically, just empty. I remember realizing in that moment that the world had been saved by two people who would never be thanked, and that nobody outside that room would ever understand how close they came to dying without warning. The missile never reached atmosphere. Debris burned harmlessly above the planet. People would later record streaks in the sky and call them meteors. They weren't wrong, they just didn't know. The world didn't pause. That was the strangest part. There was no global silence, no collective intake of breath, no sense that 8 billion people had brushed past the edge of extinction and somehow stayed upright. Morning arrived on schedule. Alarm clocks rang. Traffic reports complained about congestion. Children asked for breakfast. Somewhere a person looked at the sky, saw faint streaks of light fading too fast to film properly, and thought nothing of it. That was the price of success. If we'd failed, everyone would have known. Because we didn't, no one needed to. In the hours after the intercept, command structures shifted from panic to containment. There were no victory speeches, no congratulations, just a quiet, methodical transition into damage assessment and confirmation loops designed to eliminate doubt. Sensors verified what eyes never saw. No nuclear detonation, no atmospheric burst, no electromagnetic effects, no seismic signatures. The missile had died before it could become history. Debris burned up far above the weather, scattered into fragments too small and too cold to matter by the time they reached the lower atmosphere. The sky healed itself in minutes. The planet never noticed. On the ground, dystopia didn't change overnight. Collapse doesn't reverse just because catastrophe is avoided. But something shifted. The nuclear sites were secured. Disablement teams completed their work. Warheads were rendered inert, removed, dismantled, or buried in procedures so dense and boring that even ambition lost interest. Without nuclear leverage, the warlords lost gravity. Some tried to posture, some tried to resist. Most simply faded when they realized the thing that made them dangerous was gone. A few were absorbed into provincial authorities, stripped of titles and slowly neutralized by the dull machinery of administration. The cities remained scarred, hospitals rebuilt slowly, water systems came back in patches, aid arrived, cautious and conditional. Dystopia survived, not intact but alive. Those of us involved didn't talk about it, not because we were ordered not to, but because there was nothing useful to say. You don't relive moments like that casually. You don't share them over drinks or turn them into anecdotes. The scale is wrong. The words feel obscene. Paperwork arrived later, redacted, sanitized, carefully phrased to remove agency from individuals and assign it to systems, responses, and coordinated efforts. That was intentional. Systems don't grieve, individuals do. When I returned, home felt staged. The lights worked, the water ran clear, stores were full. People complained about prices and schedules and politics like those things were permanent features of reality. I tried to re enter normal life the way everyone does, by pretending it had always been normal. It didn't work. I didn't unpack. I didn't sleep well. And eventually, I got the address. No uniforms, no escorts, no cameras. A civilian building, third floor, a door that looked like every other door in every other city. Inside, two families sat together on the living room floor. Two women, four children. They weren't sobbing loudly. They weren't collapsing into each other. They cried the way people do when grief has passed the explosive stage and settled into something heavy and permanent. Soft, controlled, exhausted. Between them, laid out carefully, like artifacts or photographs, a beach, a birthday cake, a camping trip, a badly framed selfie where everyone was laughing at nothing important. Whole families, frozen in moments that mattered more than they ever knew. I wasn't introduced. I didn't introduce myself. There was nothing to introduce. One of the women looked up and nodded, not in greeting, in recognition. They knew. Not the details, not the math, not the speed or the altitude, or the phrase main body intercept, but they knew what had been done. One of the children, 6, maybe 7, looked up at me with red eyes and asked a question that cut through every justification I'd built for myself. Was my dad brave? No one answered immediately. The room held its breath. Then his mother pulled him close, pressed her forehead against his hair, and said quietly, carefully, like each word had been rehearsed until it no longer shook. He did his job. That was enough. It had to be. There will be no monument, no plaque, no memorial day, no history book chapter with their names highlighted. The world doesn't need to know how close it came to ending, and it doesn't need heroes it might argue about later. What it needs is continuity, morning routines, school schedules, arguments about trivial things. Normal. I carry it. Not pride, not regret. Just weight. The knowledge that survival is not guaranteed by technology, or treaties, or rational actors. Sometimes it's guaranteed by two anonymous people in a place the sky turns black, making a decision no one should ever have to make, and not hesitating. Somewhere between atmosphere and stars, metal met metal at impossible speed, and because of that, the world kept turning. That's the story. That's all of it. And that's enough.